The interview invitation had arrived in an email that Haley reread so many times the words had nearly memorized themselves inside her mind. Every sentence felt unreal because opportunities like this rarely found people like her. She lived in a tiny apartment above a noisy repair shop where every passing truck rattled the windows, and every evening she divided her paycheck into careful piles that somehow never stretched far enough. Most of her money disappeared into rent, groceries, and medicine for her younger sister Emma, whose worsening heart condition demanded surgery they could not afford. Every hospital visit ended with another polite explanation, another estimate covered in intimidating numbers, and another promise from Haley that she would find a way somehow. She never admitted that she had absolutely no idea how. The interview at the prestigious luxury fashion company represented more than employment. It represented time. More weeks before Emma's health declined further. More chances to gather enough money. More hope. On the morning of the interview she wore the only blazer she owned, carefully stitched where the sleeve had once torn, and walked through rain with shoes that leaked whenever she stepped into a puddle. By the time she reached the headquarters, the towering glass building reflected silver clouds while elegantly dressed employees hurried through revolving doors without noticing the nervous woman clutching a worn portfolio against her chest. Haley paused before entering, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "Just don't ruin this." The lobby looked less like an office and more like an art museum. Sculptures stood beneath floating lights while enormous digital displays showcased luxurious lingerie collections that resembled wearable architecture rather than clothing. A receptionist smiled professionally before directing Haley toward the executive floor. Unfortunately, construction had temporarily closed one hallway, redirecting visitors through unfamiliar corridors marked with confusing signs. Haley followed arrows, turned corners, climbed another staircase, and eventually reached a polished wooden door she assumed belonged to human resources. She knocked gently. No answer came. Believing she had arrived early, she eased the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond immediately erased every expectation she had carried. Velvet walls absorbed the light while shelves displayed handcrafted leather accessories beside mannequins wearing elaborate corsets and silk garments unlike anything she had ever imagined. Antique mirrors reflected crimson curtains surrounding an elevated platform furnished with elegant restraint equipment that looked expensive enough to belong inside a luxury showroom rather than a hidden chamber. Haley froze so completely she forgot how to breathe. "You're late," a calm voice said behind her. She spun around. Standing near another doorway was a woman whose composed confidence filled the room more effectively than any decoration. Lexi wore a sharply tailored black suit, silver cufflinks, and an expression that revealed almost nothing. She wasn't merely attractive. She possessed the kind of presence that caused conversations to stop whenever she entered a room. I'm sorry," Haley stammered. "I think I walked into the wrong office." Lexi studied her without replying immediately. "Interesting. I really should leave. You're today's product tester." "I'm sorry?" "Different than usual." Lexi slowly circled Haley with careful observation. No rehearsed confidence. No artificial enthusiasm. Whoever recruited you made an unusual choice. Haley blinked repeatedly. "I came for a job interview." Technically, so did every tester. Before Haley could explain further, another woman entered carrying a digital tablet. "Ms. Ashcroft, the schedule has already shifted 20 minutes. Should I begin recording observations?" Lexi nodded once. "Yes." The assistant smiled politely toward Haley. "Please follow me." Everything happened too quickly. Haley attempted to explain the misunderstanding twice, but both women interpreted her confusion as nervousness. She found herself seated inside a private fitting suite where luxurious fabrics surrounded her. A contract rested upon the table. "Confidentiality agreement," the assistant explained. "Standard procedure." Haley finally interrupted. "I really think you've mistaken me for someone else." The assistant frowned before checking the tablet. "Name?" "Haley Brooks." She scanned the file again. "Curious. You're listed only as H. Brooks." Moments later Lexi entered carrying several sketches. "The agency simplified your file." She placed the drawings across the table. Our company develops premium intimacy products and luxury lingerie intended for clients seeking trust, communication, and emotional vulnerability rather than shock value. Testers evaluate comfort, craftsmanship, and psychological experience. Haley stared at the illustrations with growing disbelief. I don't know anything about this. Lexi folded her arms. Honesty. Rare. Because I truly don't belong here. Then why did you sign the confidentiality form? Haley looked down. Her signature already covered the final page. Panic rushed through her. I thought it was interview paperwork. Silence settled between them before Lexi unexpectedly laughed. It wasn't loud or mocking. It was brief, genuine, and so unexpected that even her assistant stared. Cancel the session, Lexi said. Apparently I've kidnapped a job applicant. Embarrassment flooded Haley's face. I'm so sorry. Actually, Lexi replied while examining her portfolio lying beside the chair, may I? Haley nodded weakly. Lexi opened the folder and slowly turned each page. Inside were hand-drawn clothing concepts created during late nights after exhausting work shifts. Most were simple dresses, practical alterations, and inexpensive garments designed for comfort. Then Lexi paused before several delicate lingerie sketches hidden near the back. These are yours? Haley hesitated. They're just ideas. I never showed anyone because they aren't professional. Lexi continued studying every line. Who taught you fabric structure? Nobody. I repaired old clothes and experimented. These support curves naturally without unnecessary seams. She looked directly into Haley's eyes. You solved engineering problems that experienced designers often miss. Haley laughed nervously. You're being kind. No. I'm being accurate. Before another word could be exchanged, Haley's phone vibrated repeatedly. She apologized before answering. The call came from the hospital. Emma's latest examination had revealed further complications. Doctors strongly recommended moving the surgery forward. The estimated cost increased dramatically. Haley listened quietly until she finally whispered, "Thank you. I'll figure something out." When she lowered the phone, the hope that had carried her into the building collapsed completely. Lexi noticed. Bad news. My sister. Haley forced a smile that failed immediately. She needs surgery sooner than expected. Insurance? Not enough. Family? Just me. Lexi remained silent for several moments before asking one unexpected question. How much? Haley answered reluctantly. The amount hung heavily inside the luxurious room. Lexi turned toward the window overlooking the city. Coincidentally, she said, our long-term educational testing program begins next week. Haley frowned. Educational? Participants receive extensive compensation while learning product development, garment construction, client psychology, and luxury design under confidentiality. Why would someone pay that much? Because discretion has value. Lexi placed another contract upon the table, thicker than the first. You would participate willingly. Clear boundaries. Safe words. Training focused equally on communication, trust, craftsmanship, and design. Nothing occurs without explicit consent. At any moment you may refuse individual activities. Haley stared at the figures printed near the final page. The compensation exceeded anything she could imagine earning elsewhere in years. This would pay for Emma's surgery. Yes. Why offer it to me? Lexi answered without hesitation. Because I believe your talent deserves an opportunity, and because desperation should not force gifted people into hopelessness. Haley spent the entire night reading every page. She researched unfamiliar terminology, highlighted sections requiring clarification, and wrote dozens of questions. The following morning she returned not because the money tempted her alone, but because Lexi had invited every difficult conversation instead of avoiding them. During the contract meeting, Haley challenged nearly every clause. She negotiated scheduled breaks, educational requirements, financial transparency, and complete freedom to terminate the agreement after specific milestones. Lexi accepted most revisions with visible approval. "You negotiate better than many executives," Lexi observed. Haley smiled slightly. "I've spent years arguing with utility companies." The first weeks transformed nearly every assumption Haley held. Instead of intimidation, training emphasized communication. Instead of obedience, Lexi demanded honesty. Every exercise began with conversation and ended with evaluation. Trust wasn't expected. It was built deliberately. Haley learned how posture influenced confidence, how fabric affected emotion, why luxury garments balanced engineering with beauty, and how vulnerability depended more upon mutual respect than authority. Outside scheduled sessions, Lexi insisted Haley spend equal time inside the design studio. Veteran seamstresses introduced advanced stitching methods while pattern makers explained structural mathematics hidden inside elegant silhouettes. Haley absorbed knowledge with astonishing speed. Whenever she encountered an unfamiliar technique, she practiced until midnight rather than giving up. Her rough sketches gradually evolved into sophisticated designs blending comfort with elegance. Employees who initially assumed she had been hired through unusual circumstances slowly recognized genuine talent. One afternoon, senior designer Marianne dismissed Haley's proposal before barely examining it. Too inexperienced. Haley quietly accepted the criticism until Lexi unexpectedly placed both designs upon a conference table during the next meeting. "Compare seam distribution," Lexi instructed the entire department. After several minutes, even Marianne reluctantly admitted Haley's construction required fewer support panels while improving flexibility. Rather than humiliating Marianne, Haley approached her later carrying coffee. "Would you explain where my fabric selection could improve?" she asked sincerely. That single conversation dissolved weeks of quiet hostility. Marianne became one of her strongest mentors. Meanwhile, Emma's surgery date approached. Lexi never mentioned the money again. Payment arrived exactly as promised, deposited without ceremony. On surgery day, Haley remained inside the hospital from dawn until evening. Lexi appeared unexpectedly carrying food neither of them touched. During the longest hours they spoke about childhood memories, embarrassing mistakes, favorite books, and dreams abandoned long ago. Not once did Lexi discuss contracts or business. When the surgeon finally announced the operation had succeeded, Haley burst into tears before embracing the nearest person, only realizing seconds later that she held Lexi tightly. Instead of stepping away, Lexi simply rested one reassuring hand upon her back until the overwhelming relief settled into quiet breathing. Something changed after that day, not through dramatic confession but through countless ordinary moments. They argued passionately over design concepts. They laughed over disastrous sewing experiments. They shared silent evenings reviewing fabric samples while rain struck enormous studio windows. Haley gradually noticed tiny details others overlooked. Lexi always remembered everyone's coffee preferences. She secretly repaired damaged prototypes herself before junior designers arrived each morning. She visited retired employees every holiday without announcing it publicly. Beneath disciplined professionalism lived extraordinary kindness protected behind carefully maintained distance. Months passed. Haley's confidence grew visible. She no longer apologized before expressing opinions. She challenged Lexi during strategy meetings whenever she believed customers deserved better products. Instead of becoming irritated, Lexi increasingly relied upon those disagreements. "Everyone else tells me what I want to hear," she admitted after one meeting. "You tell me when I'm wrong. Sometimes you're very wrong." Lexi laughed. Dangerous habit. Necessary habit. Their friendship deepened until affection quietly entered spaces neither acknowledged. During a charity fashion gala, Haley appeared wearing a gown she had designed herself. When she descended the grand staircase, conversations throughout the ballroom faded. Lexi, who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without visible emotion, forgot the sentence she had been speaking. Later that evening they escaped onto a balcony overlooking glittering city lights. "You look distracted," Haley teased. Lexi answered honestly. You are extraordinarily beautiful. The words lingered between them. Haley looked away toward the skyline, smiling despite herself. You're making this complicated. It already became complicated weeks ago. Neither kissed the other. Instead, they remained beside each other while distant music drifted across the night, understanding that some moments required patience rather than urgency. Their growing closeness, however, attracted attention. Members of the board questioned Lexi's judgment. Anonymous rumors spread throughout the company suggesting favoritism. A rival executive secretly attempted to obtain confidential prototypes by manipulating dissatisfied employees. When one prototype disappeared, suspicion immediately targeted Haley because of her unusual hiring history. Security footage conveniently omitted crucial minutes. Rather than defending herself emotionally, Haley calmly requested access to every workshop schedule, inventory log, and shipping record. She spent 2 sleepless nights reconstructing movements. Not come from greed alone. Lexi frowned. And what does that mean? Walter gestured gently toward Adrian. He believes he is protecting the company from inefficiency. He then turned slightly toward Lexi. You believe you are protecting it from losing its identity. He looked across the room. Both of you are correct. And both of you are incomplete. Adrian stepped closer. So your solution was to pit us against each other until we reached a compromise you could control. Walter answered without hesitation. My solution was to ensure the company was forced to articulate what it actually values before external markets decide it for you. A ripple of unease moved through the audience. Someone from the legal team finally spoke up. This goes beyond governance. This may constitute unlawful interference in corporate decision-making. Walter nodded. It might. Then why admit it? Walter looked around the room. Because secrecy only protects systems that are already healthy. His gaze returned to Lexi. And this system is no longer healthy enough to survive illusions. Lexi studied him for a long moment. You've been protecting it, she said carefully, or shaping it? Walter considered the distinction. Both. Haley stepped closer to Lexi. We need to separate what he did from what actually matters now. Lexi nodded slightly, but her eyes never left Walter. If everything you said is true, then Adrian's takeover isn't the only plan running underneath this company. Walter inclined his head. Correct. Adrian's voice sharpened. How many layers are there? Walter answered simply. Enough that no single person can accidentally destroy what has taken decades to stabilize. Arthur exhaled slowly. You built redundancies into human behavior. Walter corrected him gently. I observed them. Clara looked toward Adrian. Which means the current conflict was not the first intended outcome. Walter shook his head. No. It is the first where every major participant understands they are part of the structure. Silence returned, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of recalibration. Lexi finally spoke again. If this is a controlled pressure system, she said slowly, then what is the actual decision point? Walter's answer came without delay. It is not a decision point. He paused. It is a revelation point. Haley frowned. Revelation of what? Walter looked at all of them. Whether this company can define its identity without relying on any single person's interpretation of it. Adrian shook his head slightly. That's impossible. Every strategy reflects leadership. Walter replied, exactly. Lexi felt something shift in her understanding. You're not testing leadership, she said quietly. You're testing whether leadership is even the right structure anymore. Walter met her gaze. Now you are asking the correct question. A new silence settled, deeper than before. Even the board members who had been preparing legal objections seemed unsure whether the situation could still be categorized in familiar terms. Haley looked toward Lexi. This isn't just about stopping a takeover anymore. Lexi nodded slowly. It never was. Adrian lowered the envelope in his hand. For the first time since the meeting began, his certainty appeared fractured. If this system is designed to force clarity, he said, then what happens after clarity is reached? Walter answered simply. Then it dissolves. The word landed heavily. Arthur spoke immediately. You're describing controlled deconstruction of corporate authority. Walter corrected him again. I am describing completion of a process. Clara's voice was quiet but firm. And who authorized you to decide when it completes? Walter looked at her without hesitation. No one. That answer caused a different kind of reaction, less shock, more realization. Not that Walter had acted alone, but that the system he described did not require external approval to exist. Lexi stepped forward again, her voice steady but no longer purely executive. If we accept that this structure exists, then we also accept that none of our actions today are separate from it. Walter nodded. Correct. Haley added, which means even this conversation is part of it, Walter finished. Adrian closed the envelope fully. Then what is our agency? Walter's expression softened slightly. That is what you are finally being asked to define. For the first time, no one immediately responded. The auditorium, once a place of corporate authority and clear hierarchy, now felt like a space where every role had been temporarily suspended. Lexi looked at Haley. Haley looked back at Lexi. Neither spoke, but the understanding between them was immediate. Whatever came next would not be decided through negotiation alone. It would require a choice about what the company meant at its most fundamental level, beyond ownership, beyond strategy, beyond even Walter's unseen architecture. And as the silence deepened, it became clear that the true turning point had not yet arrived. It was still approaching. The silence stretched long enough that it began to feel like another presence in the room, something almost physical pressing in from all sides. Then, unexpectedly, Lexi broke it with a single step backward, not away from Walter, but away from the instinct to treat the moment like a problem to be solved immediately. Haley noticed first and matched her movement, aligning herself beside Lexi instead of ahead or behind. That small adjustment changed the energy between them more than any speech could have. Adrian observed it carefully, as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation again. Arthur remained still, but his eyes tracked every shift like a man watching a structure he once helped design being tested beyond its original limits. Walter, however, simply waited. Lexi finally spoke, her voice quieter than before but more deliberate. If this system exists the way you describe it, she said, then it has already influenced every decision we've made today. Walter nodded once. Yes. Haley crossed her arms lightly. Which means arguing within it won't resolve anything on its own. Correct, Walter said again. Adrian exhaled sharply. Then what exactly are we supposed to do? Step outside of it? Walter answered without hesitation. You cannot step outside something you are embedded within. You can only recognize it. That distinction seemed to land differently for each person in the room. For some, it sounded philosophical. For others, structural. For Adrian, it appeared unsettlingly practical. Lexi turned slightly toward the board members. Then we stop treating this as a vote between two strategies. She looked back at Walter. And instead treat it as a question of continuity. Arthur narrowed his eyes. Continuity of what? Lexi did not answer immediately. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, then turned to face everyone at once. Continuity of intent. Haley's gaze sharpened. Meaning? Lexi gestured subtly toward the space between all of them. We've spent the last 24 hours assuming we are choosing between modernization and preservation. She paused. But Walter is suggesting something else entirely. That both of those ideas are interpretations layered over a deeper function. Adrian tilted his head. And what function would that be? Lexi looked at him directly. Adaptation without identity loss. That phrase seemed to shift something in Adrian's expression, not agreement, but recognition that the framing itself was closer to his own internal conflict than anything he had heard before. Walter observed this carefully. "You are beginning to see it," he said quietly. Haley stepped forward. "See what?" Walter answered, "That every version of this company that survives must be capable of absorbing change without becoming unrecognizable to itself." Arthur folded his arms. "That is easier said than measured." Walter gave a faint nod. "Which is why it was never measured. Only tested." Clara finally spoke again, her voice measured but more personal than before. "And what happens when the test fails?" Walter looked at her for a long moment. "Then something better replaces it." That answer created a new tension, not fear, but uncertainty about authority itself. Adrian stepped forward, his voice controlled but no longer entirely confident. "If this structure has been shaping outcomes for decades, then every major decision I've made may have been anticipated. Even guided." Walter did not deny it. "Some were." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Including the takeover plan?" "Yes." Adrian absorbed that slowly. "Then I was never acting independently." Walter corrected him gently. "You were acting sincerely within a constrained environment." Haley immediately responded. "That sounds like the same thing with different language." Walter nodded. "It often is." Lexi turned slightly, looking between Adrian and Walter. Then the question becomes whether sincerity inside a guided system still counts as choice. The room went still again, but this time the silence felt like it belonged to the question itself rather than the uncertainty of those hearing it. Arthur rubbed his forehead slowly. "This is moving beyond corporate governance entirely." Walter replied calmly, "Corporate governance is only one expression of it." Adrian suddenly looked toward Lexi. "If we accept that, then my entire argument about efficiency, restructuring, and survival is not invalid, it's incomplete." Lexi nodded once. "Yes." Haley added carefully, "And so is mine about preservation and identity." Adrian exhaled slowly. "Then we've all been arguing partial truths." Walter's expression softened slightly. "That is the first accurate conclusion spoken today." A faint, uneasy laugh escaped one of the board members, quickly swallowed by the atmosphere. Lexi looked at Haley again, and this time there was no executive posture in her expression at all, only clarity shared between two people trying to understand something larger than either of them had prepared for. "If neither position is complete," Lexi said, "then what does a decision even look like anymore?" Walter answered immediately. "It looks like defining constraints instead of outcomes." Haley frowned. "Constraints?" "Values that cannot be traded away regardless of circumstance," Walter explained. Arthur slowly nodded as if following a long-delayed realization. "So instead of choosing a direction, we define boundaries." Walter acknowledged him. "Yes." Adrian's gaze sharpened again. "And who defines those boundaries?" Walter looked around the room. "All of you." That answer finally shifted something fundamental. Because for the first time, Walter was not presenting himself as controller, strategist, or hidden architect. He was placing responsibility back into the room in a way that could not be outsourced to expertise or authority. Lexi exhaled slowly. "Then the real vote isn't about Adrian's proposal." She looked toward the audience. "It's about what this company refuses to become, no matter what pressures exist." Haley nodded. "And what it will always protect." Arthur added quietly, "Even under conditions we cannot predict." Clara folded her hands. "That is far more difficult than choosing between two strategies." Adrian looked at the envelope in his hands again, then slowly closed it and placed it on the podium beside him. "Then we are no longer discussing a takeover." Walter shook his head. "No, we are discussing identity under pressure." "Yes." Lexi stepped closer to Haley, their shoulders nearly touching. "Then we start there." The chairwoman finally stood. "If that is the direction this assembly is taking, then I propose we adjourn formal voting procedures. She looked around the room carefully. And reconvene as a full stakeholder council session within 48 hours. Murmurs spread, but no one objected strongly. The structure of authority had not collapsed, but it had clearly shifted. Adrian nodded slowly, accepting something he had not fully anticipated when he began the meeting. 48 hours is acceptable. Walter added quietly, it will be enough. Lexi looked at him. Enough for what? Walter's answer was simple. For you to decide what remains when everything else becomes negotiable. And for the first time since the confrontation began, no one in the room treated that statement as metaphor. It sounded like instruction. The auditorium did not empty immediately. Even after the chairwoman formally adjourned the session, people remained seated as if standing up would acknowledge that reality had already changed shape and they were not yet ready to walk inside it. Conversations started in fragments, half-formed questions, unfinished theories, cautious speculation, but none of them fully committed to direction. Lexi noticed it first, no one was arguing anymore. They were translating. Turning something too large into smaller pieces just to make it speakable again. Haley stayed close as Lexi stepped back toward the front row. Adrian was already there, still near the podium, the envelope now resting beside him like something decommissioned rather than resolved. Arthur approached from the side aisle, followed by Clara, who looked less like an outsider now and more like someone who had been reinserted into a story she had never fully left. Walter, however, remained near the center aisle, watching without urgency. Lexi finally addressed Adrian directly. Are you staying? Adrian looked up, surprised by the simplicity of the question after everything that had been said. Yes, he answered after a moment. But not in the same role. Haley tilted her head slightly. What does that mean? Adrian exhaled slowly. It means I no longer trust any plan that assumes stability is something we can design alone. Arthur nodded once, as if acknowledging a shift he had already been anticipating in silence. Clara studied Adrian carefully. That's a significant admission for someone who built their career on predictability models. Adrian gave a faint, almost self-aware smile. Then consider it the first model that failed correctly. A few people nearby heard that and reacted with uncertain amusement, not fully understanding whether it was humor or resignation. Lexi turned slightly toward Walter. You said this system dissolves after clarity is reached. Walter nodded. Yes. Then what replaces it? Walter's answer came more slowly this time. What you choose to replace it with. That answer hung differently now than it had earlier. It no longer sounded like abstraction. It sounded like absence waiting to be filled. Haley looked around the room. We're still inside the same company, she said quietly, but it feels like we've stepped into a different version of it. Arthur replied, because the assumptions holding it together have been exposed. Clara added, exposure doesn't destroy systems. It reveals whether they can adapt. Lexi took that in carefully. Then we need a framework for adaptation that isn't dependent on any single authority. Adrian glanced toward her. That sounds like decentralization. Lexi shook her head. Not decentralization. Shared definition. Walter watched them with something like quiet approval, though it was difficult to read his expression as anything other than controlled observation. You are moving toward the correct layer, he said. Haley crossed her arms lightly. And what layer is that? Walter answered, the one where companies stop being treated as machines and start being treated as agreements. Arthur frowned slightly. Agreements between whom? Walter looked around the auditorium again. Between everyone who was affected by their existence. That statement changed the temperature of the room in a way no presentation had managed to do all day. Because it included people who were not in leadership. Not in governance. Not even in strategy discussions. It included everyone who depended on the company without ever influencing its direction. Lexi seemed to realize this at the same time as Haley. Employees, Lexi said quietly. Walter nodded. Yes. Haley followed immediately. Customers. Another nod. Yes. Adrian added, slowly, communities that rely on supply chains. Yes. Arthur exhaled. Then the company is larger than its board by definition. Walter replied simply, it always was. A long pause followed, not from confusion, but from recalculation. Lexi finally spoke. Then our next step cannot be internal alone. Walter agreed. Correct. Haley looked at Lexi. We bring them into the process. Lexi nodded once. Not as audience. As participants. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. That changes everything. It already has, Lexi replied. Clara looked toward Walter. And this was always your intention? Walter did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried something closer to honesty than strategy. My intention was to prevent decisions being made in isolation from consequences until consequences became irreversible. Arthur studied him carefully. That's not governance. That's intervention. Walter nodded. Sometimes they are indistinguishable. Lexi took a slow breath. Then we formalize a new process tomorrow. Haley turned toward her. You're deciding that now? Lexi looked back at her. We don't have the luxury of pretending we're still inside normal governance timelines. Adrian nodded once. Agreed. Arthur added, we'll need structure. Clara said, and transparency. Walter offered nothing further, only observing as if the conversation had already begun to align itself toward an outcome he was no longer required to define. The chairwoman reappeared briefly at the edge of the auditorium, speaking quietly with legal counsel before approaching Lexi. The board supports reconvening under expanded stakeholder inclusion, she said. But we will need a clear operational definition by tomorrow evening. Lexi nodded. You'll have it. As the room finally began to disperse, movement replaced stillness in uneven waves. Employees stood in clusters, speaking more openly now, testing interpretations of what they had just witnessed. Some were energized. Others unsettled. Many were still trying to locate where authority now actually resided. Adrian walked beside Lexi toward the exit. Do you trust me? He asked suddenly. Lexi did not answer immediately. When she did, it was not the answer he expected. I trust that you are sincere. Adrian looked at her. That's not the same thing. Lexi nodded. No. It isn't. A faint pause. But sincerity is the only place any new system can begin. Haley, walking just behind them, added quietly, everything else can be verified later. Arthur fell into step beside Clara. I never thought I'd see a governance model start with uncertainty as an input. Clara replied, that's because most systems pretend uncertainty is a flaw instead of a condition. At the back of the auditorium, Walter remained for a moment longer as the last of the crowd filtered out. He looked at the empty rows, then at the podium where Adrian's envelope still sat untouched. After a few seconds, he approached it, picked it up, and instead of removing anything else from within, simply closed it fully and carried it with him toward the exit. Outside, the city continued unchanged: traffic, noise, routine movement, completely unaware that inside one building a company had stopped behaving like a hierarchy and had begun, however uncertainly, behaving like a shared question. And somewhere in that transition, without announcement or ceremony, the next phase had already begun. The following morning arrived without ceremony, but the building did not feel the same when Lexi stepped inside. It was not quieter or louder, not more crowded or emptier, it simply felt as though every corridor now carried awareness. People no longer moved through it as if decisions lived only upstairs. They moved as if decisions were distributed through every interaction, every glance, every pause before speaking. Haley noticed it too as they walked toward the executive floor. Everyone's watching everything differently, she said. Lexi nodded. Because they know something foundational is being rewritten. Arthur was already in the conference space when they arrived, surrounded by projected diagrams that no longer represented a single proposal but multiple branching frameworks. Clara stood beside him, marking sections with calm precision, while Adrian reviewed notes on a tablet with the expression of someone trying to separate habit from understanding. Walter was not in the room yet. That absence was noticed, but not questioned aloud. The chairwoman arrived next, followed by legal counsel and several senior department heads. There was no formal announcement this time, no opening declaration. The meeting simply began because it had to. Arthur spoke first. We cannot proceed with last week's governance model under expanded stakeholder inclusion without redefining decision authority. He pointed to the screen. Right now, we have overlapping responsibility zones that create ambiguity rather than clarity. Haley responded immediately. Ambiguity is not necessarily failure if it allows shared input. Arthur nodded. True. But ambiguity without boundaries becomes paralysis. Lexi listened carefully, recognizing that both perspectives were correct in different ways. Adrian leaned forward. Then we define boundaries first. Clara shook her head slightly. Boundaries without shared values just recreate hierarchy under a different name. The tension was no longer adversarial. It was structural. Every sentence now felt like an attempt to stabilize a system that refused to settle into a single shape. The chairwoman finally intervened. We need a proposal that can function today, not just philosophically. That redirected the conversation. Arthur adjusted the display. Option 1, maintain board authority but introduce advisory stakeholder panels with binding consultation requirements. Haley frowned. That still centralizes power. Yes, Arthur admitted. But preserves operational speed. Clara added, and risks disconnecting lived experience from final decisions. Adrian pointed to another model. Option 2, distributed decision councils across departments with cross-representation voting. Lexi studied it. That risks fragmentation. Adrian agreed. Yes. But increases local accuracy. Haley leaned forward. Accuracy without cohesion becomes inconsistency across the brand. Silence followed again, shorter this time but still unresolved. Lexi finally spoke. We're still thinking in structures that assume stability is static. Everyone looked at her. She continued. But Walter said the system is about adaptation under pressure, not fixed design. Arthur responded carefully. Then we need a model that evolves. Clara corrected him. Not evolves randomly. Evolves with constraints. Adrian added, like a living protocol. That phrase changed the tone of the room slightly. Lexi repeated it quietly. A living protocol. Haley nodded slowly. Decisions adapt based on conditions, but within fixed principles. Arthur leaned back slightly. That would require defining principles so clearly they can withstand interpretation without losing meaning. Clara looked toward Lexi. Which brings us back to identity. The word landed heavily again, but this time it no longer felt abstract. It felt like the only remaining stable reference point. At that moment, the door opened. Walter entered. He was carrying no documents, no devices, no visible indication of authority. Yet his presence immediately shifted attention without effort. He looked around once before speaking. You are closer. Arthur folded his arms. Closer to what? Walter answered simply. To designing a system that can survive disagreement without collapsing. Adrian studied him. You knew this direction from the beginning. Walter did not deny it. I knew the constraints. Haley stepped forward. Why not tell us earlier? Walter's response was steady. Because understanding imposed is not understanding tested. That statement settled into the group with uncomfortable clarity. Lexi turned toward him. Then test it now. Walter nodded once. Good. He walked to the screen and pointed at the central framework they had been building.
Define 3 principles that cannot be violated under any condition. Arthur immediately responded. Financial viability. Haley added, human dignity. Adrian paused, then said, long-term adaptability. Clara added after a moment, continuity of trust. Walter considered the list. You have 4. Arthur frowned. We should reduce it. Walter shook his head. No. Lexi studied the 4 principles carefully. They conflict. Walter nodded. They must. Silence followed, but this time it was different. It was not uncertainty. It was confrontation with design reality. Haley spoke quietly. So the system is meant to hold contradiction. Walter replied, yes. Adrian leaned forward. Then the question becomes how decisions are made when principles conflict. Walter answered, that is the protocol. Arthur looked at the screen again. We'd need a decision engine that evaluates trade-offs without eliminating any principle entirely. Clara added, and a mechanism to prevent any single principle from dominating over time. Lexi exhaled slowly. That means no final authority. Walter corrected gently. It means no permanent authority. The distinction shifted the room again. Not elimination of leadership, but removal of permanence. Haley looked at Lexi. That changes how power works. Lexi nodded. It makes it conditional. Adrian spoke quietly. And accountable at every moment, not just during elections or reviews. Walter observed them carefully. Now you are designing something closer to what already exists beneath your conflict. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Walter replied, you are describing the system you are already inside. You are simply choosing to acknowledge it. The chairwoman finally spoke. If we formalize this, it will be unprecedented in corporate governance. Lexi responded without hesitation. Then it will also be visible. Haley added, which is the point. Adrian looked at Lexi. You realize this removes the possibility of any single person steering the company alone. Lexi met his gaze. Yes. Including you. Including me. A pause. Adrian nodded slowly. Then I support it. Arthur exhaled, as if releasing tension he had been holding for days. Clara closed her notebook. Then we begin implementation design. Walter stepped back slightly, no longer at the center of the conversation. You are no longer responding to pressure, he said quietly. You are defining response. Lexi looked at him. Is that what you wanted? Walter considered the question carefully. What I wanted was irrelevant. A pause. What matters is what you will maintain when pressure returns. Haley looked around the room. It will return. Walter nodded. Always. The realization was not discouraging. It was clarifying. Because for the first time, they were not trying to eliminate pressure or escape it. They were designing a way to live inside it without breaking apart. As the meeting continued into technical detail, framework logic, stakeholder mapping, evaluation cycles, the company outside that room continued its work unaware that its internal architecture was being fundamentally redefined in real time. And somewhere between disagreement and design, between authority and adaptation, a new structure quietly began to take shape, not as a resolution, but as an ongoing condition the company would now have to learn to live within. Across the building. Her investigation revealed the theft had occurred through maintenance access during a scheduled fire inspection. The true culprit confessed after confronted with undeniable evidence. Many expected Lexi to punish everyone involved harshly. Instead, she restructured security procedures while publicly acknowledging Haley's intelligence before the entire company. Respect replaced lingering doubt. Weeks later, Haley unveiled her first independent lingerie collection. Instead of emphasizing fantasy alone, each design prioritized comfort, confidence, accessibility, and adaptable support for diverse body types. Focus groups responded emotionally. Customers described feeling elegant rather than restricted. Industry critics praised the collection for redefining luxury through empathy.
Standing backstage after the runway presentation, Hailey looked at the cheering audience before quietly saying, "I used to repair torn sleeves because people couldn't afford new clothes."
Lexi smiled proudly. "Now you're changing an industry."
Success brought another difficult decision. The contract that had begun everything approached its final day. According to its terms, Hailey could renew under expanded benefits or depart freely. She entered Lexi's office carrying the original document. Neither woman spoke immediately. Finally, Hailey asked, "If I refuse renewal, what happens?" Lexi answered softly, "You keep every design you've created. Your salary. Your position. Your future. And us?" Lexi looked toward the contract resting between them. That agreement solved a financial crisis. It should never define a relationship. She picked up the papers, studied the signatures that had once represented desperation, and slowly tore every page into small pieces. The fragments drifted into a nearby wastebasket like old leaves carried away by wind. "No obligations," Lexi said. "No power imbalance. No conditions. If you choose to remain beside me, I want it because you genuinely wish to, not because ink on paper ever demanded it." Hailey crossed the room until only inches separated them. "You gave me the chance to save my sister," she whispered. "You taught me how to believe in my own work. You challenged me when I hid from my own potential. I stayed because I needed the contract. I'm staying now because I love the woman who tore it apart." For perhaps the first time in many years, Lexi's carefully controlled composure disappeared completely. She smiled with unmistakable relief before taking Hailey's hands. Outside the office windows, the city continued moving through another ordinary afternoon, unaware that inside one quiet room 2 lives had finally stepped beyond obligation into a future chosen freely together, where trust no longer required signatures, love no longer carried conditions, and every new design they created would remind them that the strongest bonds were never stitched by force but patiently woven through honesty, courage, and the willingness to see another person's worth long before they could recognize it themselves. The first morning after the contract disappeared from existence felt strangely unfamiliar to both of them. Nothing inside the company had visibly changed. Employees hurried through polished hallways carrying samples and sketches, designers debated fabrics over coffee, assistants coordinated impossible schedules, and production meetings began exactly on time, yet Hailey noticed an invisible difference that only she and Lexi could truly understand. For the first time since they had met, neither woman occupied a role defined by an agreement. They were simply 2 people walking into work together. That simplicity somehow felt more intimidating than every carefully negotiated boundary that had come before. As they stepped out of the elevator, Lexi instinctively reached toward Hailey's hand before stopping halfway. "Habit," she admitted with an embarrassed smile. Hailey laughed softly, closed the remaining distance herself, and intertwined their fingers. "Then let's replace old habits with better ones." They released each other before entering the design department, not because anyone had forbidden public affection but because both preferred allowing their private relationship to grow without turning it into office gossip. Even so, observant co-workers quickly noticed the relaxed smiles that seemed to appear whenever the 2 crossed paths. Marianne watched them during a fabric presentation before quietly leaning toward another senior designer. "About time," she whispered. "I've been waiting 6 months." The older designer nodded knowingly. "I started betting on it after the charity gala." Neither mentioned the conversation aloud, and both deliberately treated Hailey exactly as before. Respect inside the studio had never been built upon rumors, and nobody wished to undermine that. A week later, the executive board assembled for its quarterly strategy meeting. Massive screens displayed international sales figures while investors joined through secure video connections from different countries. The atmosphere remained formal until one director cleared his throat. "Before discussing expansion, there is another matter." Lexi folded her hands calmly. "Go ahead." "Your personal relationship with one of the company's lead designers." Silence settled around the conference table. Several executives looked uncomfortable while others openly watched Lexi,
anticipating either anger or denial.
Instead, she answered with complete composure.
Yes.
The director blinked.
Yes? Yes, we are in a relationship. Another executive leaned forward. Wouldn't you agree that creates ethical concerns? Lexi nodded once. Which is why legal counsel has already prepared revised reporting structures removing any direct supervisory authority between us. She pressed a button, and detailed organizational charts appeared on the screens. Haley now reports to the Chief Creative Officer rather than directly to me. Compensation decisions require committee approval. Design competitions remain anonymous until judging concludes. Every safeguard recommended by our compliance department has already been implemented. Several directors exchanged surprised glances. One older woman slowly smiled. You anticipated this discussion. I anticipated responsible governance. The chairwoman studied every document before finally closing her folder. Then, unless anyone has evidence of misconduct, I see no reason to continue debating private matters. The meeting immediately shifted toward business. When it ended, Lexi walked into the hallway where Haley waited outside with 2 coffees. How bad? Haley asked. Lexi accepted 1 cup. I'd negotiated acquisitions worth billions. She took a sip before smiling. That conversation was somehow more stressful. Haley nudged her shoulder playfully. You'll recover. Only if you stop buying terrible coffee. Haley looked offended. It's perfectly acceptable coffee. Lexi tasted it again with theatrical seriousness. I withdraw my previous statement. It has improved from terrible to merely disappointing. Haley burst into laughter loud enough that employees nearby turned toward them smiling. The ordinary exchange dissolved the remaining tension more effectively than any reassuring speech could have managed. During the following months, international demand for Haley's collection expanded beyond expectations. Fashion magazines praised the company's evolving philosophy, describing its newest designs as luxurious without sacrificing practicality. Invitations arrived from universities requesting guest lectures. Young designers flooded social media with sketches inspired by Haley's work, often including handwritten notes describing how her story encouraged them to continue despite limited resources. One afternoon, the marketing department proposed creating a campaign centered almost entirely upon Haley's personal history. People love inspirational stories, the director explained enthusiastically. From poverty to success. It will generate enormous attention. Haley remained quiet until everyone finished discussing possible slogans. Then she slowly shook her head. No. The room fell silent. No, the director repeated. I don't want people buying our products because they pity me. She looked around the table. There are thousands of talented people working 2 jobs while caring for family members. Most of them won't become famous. Their lives aren't less valuable because cameras never arrive. If we tell any story, let's tell theirs too. Lexi watched without interrupting. Haley continued. Feature our seamstresses. Our warehouse teams. The women who test every prototype. Customers rebuilding confidence after surgery. Older clients discovering beauty doesn't expire. Young designers learning their craft. Don't make me the center of everything. Several employees slowly nodded. The campaign changed completely. Instead of focusing upon one remarkable journey, it celebrated hundreds of ordinary people whose quiet resilience formed the company's true foundation. The advertisements resonated far more deeply than anyone expected. Letters began arriving daily. Some came from cancer survivors. Others came from mothers returning to work after years at home, dancers recovering from injuries, elderly women rediscovering confidence, and students saving for fashion school. Rather than praising expensive products, many thanked the company for making them feel seen. One rainy evening, Haley remained alone inside the correspondence office reading handwritten letters while thunder rolled outside. Lexi eventually found her surrounded by opened envelopes. You've been missing for almost an hour. Haley held up a carefully folded note. Listen to this.
She read aloud words written by a retired schoolteacher who explained that after losing her husband she had stopped caring about how she dressed.
Buying one beautifully made garment had reminded her that self-respect could survive grief. When Haley finished reading, neither woman spoke immediately. Finally, Lexi quietly said, "Sometimes we forget clothing isn't just fabric."
Haley smiled thoughtfully.
"Sometimes it's permission to recognize yourself again." Months later, Emma completed her final medical examination. Doctors declared her recovery exceptional. Instead of returning directly home, Emma insisted upon visiting company headquarters.
Employees who had heard countless stories about Haley's younger sister greeted her warmly. Marianne immediately handed Emma a measuring tape and challenged her to learn basic pattern drafting. Within 30 minutes, Emma enthusiastically attempted sewing her first uneven fabric sample while everyone pretended not to notice how crooked the stitching became. Watching from across the studio, Haley wiped away tears before Emma could see them.
"Happy tears?" Lexi asked. Haley nodded.
"For years I imagined this future so many times that I convinced myself it couldn't possibly happen."
Emma eventually approached carrying the lopsided fabric rectangle with exaggerated pride.
"It's terrible," she announced cheerfully.
"Absolutely terrible." Marianne laughed. Every expert began exactly there. Emma grinned. "Then maybe there's hope." During lunch, Emma watched Lexi and Haley teasing each other over whose sketchbook contained more coffee stains. She finally interrupted. "Can I ask something?"
"Of course,"
Lexi answered.
Emma smiled mischievously.
"Which one of you realized you were in love first?" Both women answered simultaneously. "She did." Emma looked from one to the other before bursting into laughter. "You're impossible."
Several months afterward, an unexpected invitation arrived from a prestigious international design competition.
Unlike commercial fashion shows, the event prohibited brand names during judging. Every submission would be evaluated anonymously. Winning required exceptional craftsmanship alone. Haley hesitated. "If I enter, everyone will assume your reputation influenced the results." Lexi gently shook her head.
"Not if nobody knows which design belongs to you."
For 6 intense weeks, Haley practically disappeared into the workshop. She experimented with
sustainable fibers developed from recycled botanical materials, studied historical garment construction techniques preserved in museum archives, and repeatedly dismantled her own prototypes whenever she discovered even minor imperfections. Some nights she became so frustrated that she considered abandoning the project entirely.
Instead of offering easy reassurance, Lexi challenged her. "Show me the version you're afraid to attempt. It might fail. Then fail intelligently." Haley returned to work with renewed determination. The final design looked deceptively simple from a distance, yet every hidden seam demonstrated extraordinary engineering.
Comfort, elegance, flexibility, and environmental responsibility blended so naturally that judges initially struggled to understand how such complex construction appeared effortless.
Weeks later, finalists gathered inside an enormous exhibition hall.
Nobody knew which designer had created which garment until sealed envelopes were opened.
Third place. Applause. Second place. More applause.
Finally, the chief judge smiled before announcing first place.
Entry number 27. Haley looked around uncertainly until volunteers rolled her design onto the stage.
She covered her mouth in complete disbelief. Lexi, standing quietly among the audience rather than beside executives, applauded harder than anyone else. She never attempted to share the spotlight. That evening, reporters crowded around Haley requesting interviews.
One journalist asked the question everyone expected. "What is the greatest lesson you've learned during your remarkable career?" Haley considered the question carefully before answering. "People often think success arrives because one extraordinary person changes your life. That's only part of the truth.
Someone may open a door, but you still have to walk through it every day, especially when you're exhausted, uncertain, or frightened. I was fortunate enough to meet someone who believed I could become more than I imagined." The harder part was eventually believing it myself. Watching the interview from nearby, Lexi quietly slipped away before celebrations ended. She walked alone onto the rooftop garden where the city lights shimmered beneath a clear night sky. A few minutes later, footsteps approached behind her.
Haley carried 2 glasses of sparkling cider. Escaping your own party? Lexi accepted 1 glass, borrowing a little silence.
They leaned against the railing overlooking the streets far below.
When I first walked into this building, Haley said, I was terrified. Lexi smiled. You accidentally wandered into the single room most visitors never see. Best wrong turn of my life.
They laughed together before comfortable silence returned. The wind carried distant sounds of traffic while illuminated windows stretched endlessly across the skyline. After several minutes, Lexi reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box. Haley stared at it, then looked back at Lexi with widening eyes. Lexi suddenly looked far less like the composed chief executive known throughout the industry and much more like a woman hoping the next few seconds would not unravel months of careful planning. I've rehearsed this conversation several times, she admitted.
Unfortunately, every version sounded too formal. Haley smiled warmly. Then don't rehearse.
Lexi slowly opened the box, revealing a simple platinum ring with a single elegant diamond surrounded by tiny sapphires, the exact color of the thread Haley had used in her very first successful design.
You once told me the strongest stitches are the ones nobody notices because they quietly hold everything together, Lexi said. You've done that for my life in more ways than I can count.
You've challenged me, frustrated me, inspired me, and reminded me that leadership means helping people become more fully themselves instead of shaping them into what is convenient.
I don't want another contract with you. I don't want another agreement written by lawyers.
I want every ordinary morning, every ridiculous argument about coffee, every impossible deadline, every quiet evening, every victory, every disappointment, and every year that follows, if you'll share them with me. Tears filled Haley's eyes before she laughed through them. You know, she whispered, for someone who claimed not to rehearse, that was suspiciously beautiful.
Lexi smiled nervously. Is that a yes?
Haley answered by slipping the ring onto her finger herself before wrapping both arms around Lexi.
It's the easiest yes I've ever given.
Around them the city remained brilliantly alive, unaware that beneath the endless lights 2 women who had once met through an extraordinary misunderstanding had chosen one another not because of fate alone, but because day after day they had built a relationship strong enough to outlast contracts, expectations, public scrutiny, personal fears, and every unlikely coincidence that had first brought their paths together. Their engagement remained private for nearly a month, not because they wished to hide it forever, but because they wanted time to experience the news before the rest of the world transformed it into headlines and speculation. The only people who knew were Emma, Marianne, and the elderly janitor named Walter, who had accidentally witnessed Lexi nervously practicing her proposal speech in an empty conference room the day before it happened. Walter had quietly walked away without interrupting, then left a handwritten note on Lexi's desk the following morning that simply read, "If she smiles the way she smiles when she looks at you, she'll say yes." Lexi never discovered how he had known, but she kept the note inside her desk drawer beside a photograph of her late parents.
The announcement finally came during the company's annual celebration, an event attended by employees from every department rather than investors or media personalities. Instead of a dramatic presentation, Lexi concluded her speech about the year's achievements by saying, "Before we end tonight, there is one more milestone worth celebrating." She looked toward Haley, who stood near Emma at one of the tables. This company changed because remarkable people chose to believe in one another. One of those people has changed my life more than anyone else. She held up her left hand, where a matching ring caught the light. For a heartbeat the ballroom remained completely silent as everyone processed what they were seeing. Then applause erupted so suddenly that it echoed against the high ceiling. Marianne wiped away tears while pretending she had merely gotten dust in her eye. Emma cheered loud enough to embarrass herself and immediately decided she did not care.
Walter simply nodded to himself with quiet satisfaction before returning to his dessert.
By the following morning the news had spread throughout the fashion industry.
Congratulations arrived from competitors, former employees, journalists, suppliers, and designers from around the world.
Predictably, criticism arrived as well.
Anonymous commentators insisted the relationship proved Haley's success had never been earned.
Others questioned whether personal feelings could truly remain separate from business.
Haley read several articles before closing her laptop.
"It doesn't bother you?" she asked. Lexi looked up from reviewing production reports.
People who have already decided the ending of someone else's story rarely change their minds because of another chapter. I still wish they could see what actually happened.
The people who matter already do. Instead of responding publicly, they continued working. Their silence frustrated critics far more effectively than arguments ever could.
Several weeks later, the company received an invitation to participate in a humanitarian initiative supporting women rebuilding their lives after natural disasters.
Temporary housing centers had identified one overlooked problem.
Clothing donations usually focused on outerwear, while properly fitted undergarments, maternity garments, and post-surgical support clothing remained scarce.
Most companies offered surplus inventory. Haley proposed something entirely different.
"Let's build a mobile design workshop," she suggested.
"Don't decide what people need before asking them." Lexi immediately approved the idea.
Within 3 months, retired buses had been transformed into traveling tailoring studios equipped with sewing machines, fitting areas, and educational spaces. Rather than distributing identical garments, local communities collaborated with designers to create clothing reflecting their own cultures, climates, and personal preferences. Haley insisted every participant receive training if they wished, allowing many women to develop skills that later became sources of independent income. During the project's first deployment, Haley spent long days measuring fabric, teaching beginners how to operate sewing machines, and listening to stories far more powerful than anything she could have imagined. One evening, an elderly woman carefully folded a finished garment before saying, "Everyone kept bringing us things they thought we should wear.
You're the first people who asked what we wanted."
Those words remained with Haley long after she returned home. Months passed, and the humanitarian workshops expanded into several countries. The initiative became one of the company's proudest achievements, not because it generated profit, but because it reflected values that could not be measured by quarterly reports. One afternoon, Lexi found herself reviewing financial projections when an unexpected visitor requested a meeting. The receptionist announced the arrival with visible confusion. "She refuses to explain why she's here," the receptionist said.
"Only that you'll recognize the name." Lexi agreed to the meeting.
A woman in her early 60s entered carrying a weathered leather portfolio. She introduced herself simply as Eleanor. "I knew your mother," she said.
Lexi's expression changed immediately. "My mother passed away 20 years ago." Eleanor nodded gently.
"Before that, we attended design school together." She placed several faded sketchbooks on the desk. "She asked me to keep these until I believed you were ready."
Lexi slowly opened the first notebook. Every page contained exquisite fashion illustrations accompanied by handwritten notes discussing creativity, courage, and kindness in leadership.
Between the pages rested an unopened envelope addressed in elegant handwriting. "To my daughter, whenever she finally learns that success means very little if it cannot be shared." Lexi carefully unfolded the letter. Her mother's words seemed to reach across decades with startling clarity. She wrote about failure, loneliness, ambition, and the danger of confusing authority with love. Near the end, one sentence caught Lexi completely off guard. "If you ever find someone who challenges you without trying to diminish you, hold on tightly. Such people are rarer than talent itself." By the time Lexi finished reading, tears blurred the final lines.
Eleanor quietly excused herself, leaving the office without expecting thanks.
That evening, Lexi carried the sketchbooks home. Haley listened as she read portions aloud.
Neither noticed how many hours passed. Some pages inspired laughter, others quiet reflection. Near midnight, Haley closed the final notebook. "She would have been proud of you."
Lexi looked down at the old drawings. "I spent years trying to become the executive I thought she expected."
Haley rested her head against Lexi's shoulder.
"Maybe she was hoping you'd become yourself instead." Inspired by the discovery, Lexi proposed establishing a scholarship in her mother's name for aspiring designers from disadvantaged backgrounds. Unlike traditional scholarships based solely on grades or portfolios, applicants would also receive mentorship, financial planning assistance, mental health resources, and guaranteed internships.
Talent shouldn't disappear because someone can't afford tuition, Haley said during planning meetings. The inaugural class included 12 students from dramatically different backgrounds. One had grown up in foster care. Another balanced university classes while raising a child. One applicant had taught herself pattern drafting using discarded newspapers because fabric had been too expensive to practice with. Watching those students work together reminded Haley of the uncertainty she had once carried into the building herself. She made a point of speaking with every student individually rather than delivering polished motivational speeches. During one workshop, a nervous young man confessed, "Everyone here seems more talented than I am." Haley smiled knowingly. "When I first arrived, I accidentally walked into the wrong room and nearly fainted from embarrassment." The students laughed. "Seriously?" one asked. "Completely seriously." "Then how did you stay?" Haley looked around the studio before answering. "Because eventually I realized the worst thing that happened on my first day wasn't making a mistake. The worst thing would have been leaving before giving myself a chance to learn." The conversation spread through the scholarship program until students jokingly referred to unexpected opportunities as wrong room moments. The phrase eventually appeared painted across one workshop wall in colorful letters, becoming an unofficial reminder that extraordinary futures sometimes began with confusion rather than certainty. Nearly a year after their engagement, Lexi and Haley finally found time to plan their wedding. Both immediately rejected extravagant proposals involving castles, private islands, or celebrity performances. Half the company would spend the entire evening worrying about whether they were standing in the correct place, Haley said. "Exactly," Lexi agreed. "I don't want anyone checking seating charts every 5 minutes." Instead, they chose the restored Botanical Conservatory where they had once hosted a charity exhibition. Sunlight streamed through glass ceilings onto gardens, blooming in every direction. The guest list remained surprisingly modest, including family, close friends, longtime employees, scholarship students, and retired staff who had helped build the company decades earlier. Marianne accepted the role of officiant after reminding everyone that she had known exactly how the romance would end long before either bride admitted it. Walter insisted upon wearing the same polished shoes he had purchased for his own wedding 47 years earlier. Emma volunteered to organize decorations and somehow convinced half the scholarship students to help without revealing that she had secretly prepared a spectacular surprise. On the morning of the ceremony, gentle rain tapped softly against the conservatory roof before gradually giving way to warm sunshine. Guests wandered through fragrant gardens while a string quartet played arrangements chosen not because they were fashionable, but because they reminded Lexi and Haley of quiet evenings spent working long after everyone else had gone home. Neither woman saw the other before the ceremony began. Haley stood in a small preparation room with Emma adjusting the final details of her dress. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked. Haley laughed. "Terrified." "Good. Good. If this ever stopped feeling important, then I'd worry." Meanwhile, Lexi waited beneath flowering vines, taking noticeably deeper breaths than usual. Walter approached carrying 2 glasses of water. "You look like you're about to negotiate with 5 governments at once." Lexi accepted the glass gratefully. "This feels harder." Walter chuckled. "That's because business contracts can be rewritten. This promise is meant to be lived." A few minutes later, the music changed. Guests rose to their feet. Sunlight spilled through the glass ceiling, illuminating thousands of tiny reflections across the garden paths as Haley appeared at the entrance. For a long moment, the world seemed to narrow until neither woman noticed anything except the other. All the misunderstandings, challenges, triumphs, long nights, impossible deadlines, hospital corridors, sketchbooks, laughter, arguments about coffee, and countless ordinary mornings seemed to gather quietly behind them, not disappearing, but forming the path that had carried them to this single moment. Marianne smiled warmly before beginning the ceremony. "Every beautiful garment begins with individual threads that appear insignificant on their own," she said. "Only through patience, trust, and careful hands do they become something capable of lasting. Today we celebrate 2 lives woven together in exactly that way."
Just as she prepared to continue with the vows, the conservatory doors suddenly swung open. A sharply dressed stranger hurried inside carrying a sealed envelope marked with the company crest.
His expression revealed urgency rather than celebration.
He scanned the gathering until his eyes found Lexi. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, slightly out of breath.
"But this couldn't wait.
The board has received documents this morning that could change ownership of the entire company, and your signature may be the only thing standing between the future you've built and someone determined to take it away." The music faded into uneasy silence as every guest turned toward the unexpected messenger, leaving the wedding suspended on the edge of a revelation none of them had anticipated.
For several long seconds nobody moved.
The musicians lowered their instruments without being asked, conversations dissolved into uncertain whispers, and even the birds that had been fluttering through the conservatory seemed to vanish into the glass rafters above. Lexi remained standing where she was, dressed for her wedding rather than a board meeting, staring at the messenger with calm concentration instead of panic.
Haley immediately noticed the difference. Months earlier Lexi might have reacted by taking control of the situation alone.
Now she glanced toward Haley first, silently acknowledging that whatever happened next belonged to both of them. The messenger took another careful step forward.
"I wouldn't interrupt this day unless it was absolutely necessary."
He held out the thick envelope.
"These documents arrived by courier less than an hour ago. Every board member has already been contacted. They requested I find you immediately."
Lexi accepted the envelope but made no attempt to open it.
"Who sent it?" "The paperwork came through 3 separate law firms.
None of them claimed to represent the actual buyer."
Marianne folded her arms. "Anonymous investors don't usually appear in the middle of weddings. That's exactly why the board is alarmed." Haley gently touched Lexi's arm. "Open it."
Lexi broke the seal and removed a stack of legal documents. Several pages carried official certifications, financial statements, and ownership records. Near the top sat a formal notice proposing an emergency acquisition of controlling shares through a complex arrangement involving several investment companies.
Hidden within the paperwork was a single handwritten note. "We failed once. We won't fail again."
Lexi's expression hardened. Whoever planned this has been preparing for a long time.
Emma leaned closer. "Can they actually take the company?" Lexi carefully reread several paragraphs before answering. "Not today."
She looked toward the messenger.
"But someone wants us to believe they can." Walter quietly stepped beside Marianne. "Then why choose today?" Haley answered before Lexi could. "Because this isn't only about ownership."
Everyone looked toward her. She continued, "It's meant to force Lexi to choose between her personal life and her responsibility as CEO.
Whoever organized this expects she'll leave the ceremony immediately." Lexi slowly smiled. "Exactly." The messenger hesitated. "The board is waiting for instructions." Lexi looked around the conservatory.
Friends, family, employees, scholarship students, retired colleagues, and Emma all watched quietly, uncertain what would happen next.
She folded the documents neatly and handed them back.
"Tell the board to schedule an emergency meeting in 3 hours.
The messenger blinked. 3 hours? Yes. Shouldn't you leave now? Lexi shook her head.
The company has survived financial crises, lawsuits, manufacturing disruptions, and international competition. It can survive another 3 hours. She looked directly at Haley before speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. I spent years believing work deserved every first place in my life. Today my priorities are different. The tension dissolved into relieved smiles throughout the gathering. The messenger nodded respectfully.
I'll inform them. As quickly as he had arrived, he disappeared through the conservatory doors. Marianne waited another moment before clearing her throat.
Now, she said with theatrical seriousness, unless anyone else intends to interrupt with news of an asteroid or an alien invasion, I'd very much like to finish the ceremony.
Laughter rippled through the guests, breaking the remaining strain. The music resumed, softer than before. Marianne looked at Lexi. Would you like to continue? Lexi nodded. Very much.
Their vows had originally been written separately, but neither knew exactly what the other planned to say.
Lexi spoke first. The day we met, I believed I understood people because I understood negotiations. I thought every problem could be solved with preparation, strategy, and careful planning. Then you walked into the wrong room and proved how wrong I was.
You reminded me that kindness cannot be scheduled, trust cannot be purchased, and love cannot be managed like a business. You challenged me to become someone who listens before deciding, who teaches instead of commanding, and who measures success by the lives improved rather than the profits earned. I promise that no matter how complicated tomorrow becomes, I will never again allow ambition to convince me that it matters more than the people I love. Haley's eyes glistened as she began her own vows. For years I believed survival was the greatest goal anyone could hope for. Then you showed me that living is something entirely different. You believed in my abilities before I trusted them myself, but you never asked me to become a different person to deserve that belief. You celebrated my victories without trying to claim them, accepted my disagreements without treating them as disrespect, and stood beside me when I was frightened without pretending fear was weakness. I promise that wherever life leads us, whether through ordinary mornings or impossible storms, I will always choose honesty over comfort, partnership over pride, and us over every misunderstanding that tries to stand between us. There were few dry eyes left when Marianne finally smiled and said, by the authority entrusted to me, and with enormous relief that no further legal emergencies have appeared, I pronounce you married. The applause that followed seemed louder than the rain that had fallen earlier that morning. Emma hugged both of them at once so enthusiastically that all three nearly lost their balance. Walter quietly wiped away a tear before pretending to inspect the flowers. The scholarship students erupted into cheers while Marianne declared that anyone who cried during the reception would be required to admit it openly instead of blaming allergies. For the next 2 hours the conservatory became exactly what Lexi and Haley had hoped it would be. Nobody discussed market projections. Nobody worried about headlines. Retired seamstresses danced beside young interns. Executives shared tables with maintenance staff. Emma convinced Walter to teach several scholarship students an old ballroom dance that he insisted everyone had forgotten. Instead of elaborate entertainment, guests wandered through gardens exchanging stories. A memory wall displayed photographs from every stage of the company, including one slightly blurry security image of Haley's accidental first day. Someone had written beneath it in elegant lettering, "Every future begins somewhere unexpected." Eventually Lexi checked the time. The emergency board meeting could no longer be delayed. She quietly excused herself, expecting to travel alone, but Haley caught her hand. "We're married now," Haley said with a smile. "You don't have to face difficult meetings by yourself anymore." Together they left the celebration, still wearing their wedding clothes beneath light coats as they drove toward headquarters. Neither spoke much during the journey. The city moved around them in its usual rhythm, completely unaware that one of its most influential companies might be entering the most important battle in its history. As the headquarters tower came into view, Lexi slowed the car and looked at Haley. "Whatever waits upstairs may change everything." Haley squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll change with it." They stepped into the lobby side by side, wedding rings catching the afternoon light as the elevator doors opened and carried them toward the boardroom, where a circle of anxious directors, sealed evidence files, and a mystery decades in the making were already waiting. When the elevator doors slid open on the executive floor, the usual quiet confidence of headquarters had vanished. Staff members spoke in hushed voices, legal advisors carried overflowing folders between conference rooms, and every television mounted along the hallway displayed financial news channels speculating about unusual trading activity surrounding the company's stock. As Lexi and Haley walked toward the boardroom, they attracted more than a few surprised glances. Neither had changed out of their wedding attire. Lexi still wore the tailored ivory suit she had chosen for the ceremony, while Haley's elegant dress disappeared beneath a long cream-colored coat. The sight seemed to remind everyone watching that the interruption had stolen them away from one of the happiest days of their lives. Instead of appearing frustrated, however, they carried themselves with remarkable composure. The boardroom doors opened before they reached them. "We're all here," the chairwoman said quietly. "Come in." Around the polished table sat every voting director, the company's chief legal counsel, 2 outside financial investigators, and an elderly man Haley had never met before. His silver hair was neatly combed, his posture perfectly straight despite his age, and his expression suggested decades of experience observing crises without allowing emotion to cloud judgment.
The chairwoman noticed Haley's curiosity. "This is Arthur Winslow.
He served as outside counsel to the company when Lexi's parents were still alive." Arthur inclined his head respectfully.
"Congratulations on your marriage. I regret that our first meeting takes place under these circumstances." Lexi took her seat. "Let's begin." The chief legal counsel activated the large display at the front of the room. A complex network of corporations appeared across the screen, connected by dozens of ownership lines that crossed several countries. "Over the last 18 months, he explained, someone has quietly purchased minority shares through shell companies. Individually, none of the acquisitions appeared significant. Together, however, they now represent nearly 29% of voting power." One director frowned. "That's still not enough to seize control."
"Correct," Arthur replied.
"But only if the remaining shareholders stay united." Another slide appeared.
Several longtime investors had already received offers substantially above market value.
"Someone is attempting to persuade enough shareholders to sell," Arthur continued. "If successful, they could demand a restructuring of executive leadership."
Haley studied the diagrams carefully.
Something about them felt incomplete. "Who benefits?" she asked.
The room fell silent.
"We don't know," the legal counsel admitted. "The ownership trail disappears behind offshore holding companies."
Lexi tapped the handwritten note that had arrived with the documents.
"No." Everyone looked toward her. "Whoever planned this wanted me to know it was personal."
She slid the note across the table.
"We failed once. We won't fail again."
Arthur slowly removed his glasses.
"There is only one group that ever used language like that." "Who?" Haley asked.
Arthur
hesitated before answering. 23 years ago, shortly after Lexi's parents expanded the company internationally, a consortium of investors attempted a hostile takeover.
They believed luxury craftsmanship should be replaced with mass production to maximize profits. Lexi remembered fragments of conversations she had overheard as a child.
Heated phone calls. Late-night meetings. Newspapers spread across the dining room table.
Arthur continued.
"Your parents rejected every offer despite enormous financial pressure. The takeover failed. What happened afterward?" Haley asked.
Arthur's expression grew heavier.
"Most of us believed the matter ended there." Lexi looked toward the old lawyer. "But you don't believe that anymore?"
Arthur slowly nodded.
"No." A younger financial investigator stepped forward carrying another folder. "There's something else."
He projected several photographs onto the screen. They showed abandoned manufacturing buildings, old newspaper articles, and archived corporate records. Many of the shell companies share one historical connection.
They can all be traced back to an investment group once controlled by a businessman named Victor Hale. Lexi searched her memory. "He's dead."
"Officially, yes," the investigator replied. "He passed away 12 years ago."
Haley looked confused. "Then who's organizing this?" Another photograph appeared.
A much younger woman stood beside Victor Hale during a business conference decades earlier. "His daughter," the investigator said.
"Clara Hale."
Arthur leaned forward.
"She disappeared from the public business world after her father's death." "Not disappeared," Haley said quietly while studying the image. "She waited."
The room fell silent again.
Lexi noticed something unusual about the photograph. Clara wasn't looking toward the cameras.
She was watching Lexi's mother from across the conference hall. There was determination in her expression rather than admiration. "She inherited more than money," Lexi murmured. "She inherited a grudge." Before anyone could continue, the receptionist entered carrying another envelope.
This just arrived. Arthur carefully opened it. Inside lay a formal invitation rather than a legal demand.
The card was handwritten using elegant black ink.
Mrs. Ashcroft and Mrs. Brooks Ashcroft. Congratulations on your marriage.
I would prefer our first conversation to occur before lawyers complicate matters further.
Tomorrow. 7 o'clock. Come alone. The address belonged to one of the oldest private libraries in the city.
No signature appeared below the message, only a pressed white camellia carefully sealed beneath transparent paper.
Arthur frowned immediately. That flower. Lexi looked toward him. You recognize it?
Years ago Victor Hale always sent white camellias before negotiations. He believed they symbolized elegance.
Arthur paused. Your mother once told me they actually symbolized warning.
The board immediately began debating security arrangements. Several directors insisted the invitation should be ignored entirely.
Others argued the police should become involved.
One executive recommended obtaining a court injunction before any meeting took place. Throughout the discussion Haley remained unusually quiet.
Finally she spoke. Everyone here assumes Clara wants control of the company.
The room turned toward her.
What if that's only part of the plan? Lexi studied her thoughtfully. Explain. Haley pointed toward the invitation.
If she wanted to win purely through business, she'd stay anonymous until she owned enough shares. Instead she revealed herself before the takeover is complete.
Arthur slowly nodded.
Meaning she wants something more than stock ownership. She wants Lexi to know she's responsible.
Haley folded her hands. This isn't only about money. It's about making the victory personal.
Lexi looked at the handwritten note again. Which means emotions are influencing strategy. A slow smile crossed Arthur's face.
That creates weaknesses. Exactly, Haley replied. People obsessed with revenge eventually begin making decisions to satisfy old wounds rather than present realities.
The chairwoman leaned back thoughtfully.
So what do you propose? Haley looked toward Lexi. We accept the invitation. Half the board objected immediately. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. This could be a trap. Haley waited until the objections subsided. We don't walk into the meeting unprepared.
Arthur studies every historical document connected to the original takeover.
Our investigators continue tracing financial ownership.
Security monitors the location from a distance without interfering unless necessary.
Meanwhile, she smiled slightly. Lexi and I simply have a conversation. Lexi raised an eyebrow. Simply? You've negotiated with billionaires.
Haley squeezed her wife's hand beneath the table.
Now you'll negotiate with someone who's been arguing with ghosts for 20 years. Even Arthur couldn't suppress a quiet chuckle.
The meeting concluded several hours later with responsibilities assigned across every department. As employees gradually returned to their offices, headquarters regained a measure of calm, though uncertainty lingered beneath every conversation. Evening settled over the city by the time Lexi and Haley finally returned home. They changed out of their wedding clothes with almost ceremonial care, hanging each garment inside protective covers before sitting together on the living room floor surrounded by unopened wedding gifts.
Neither felt much like celebrating yet. Haley eventually picked up a small package tied with blue ribbon.
Inside rested a simple handmade quilt stitched together from dozens of different fabric scraps.
A note accompanied it. Dear Lexi and Haley.
Every piece came from leftover materials that would otherwise have been discarded. Alone they seemed insignificant.
Together they became something warm enough to last. Congratulations, Walter.
Haley spread the quilt across both their shoulders. Lexi leaned against her, exhausted for the first time all day. Not exactly the honeymoon I imagined.
Haley smiled softly. Tomorrow we meet a woman who's spent decades planning revenge. That's one way to begin married life.
They sat together in comfortable silence as the city lights shimmered outside the windows.
Neither knew what Clara Hale truly wanted, whether the company could withstand the coming battle, or how many secrets from the past remained hidden. They knew only one thing with complete certainty.
This time, unlike every challenge before, they would face whatever came, not as employer and employee, not as mentor and student, not even as two people cautiously falling in love, but as partners whose promises had been spoken only hours earlier, promises that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine.
Morning arrived with unusual stillness.
The city outside their apartment awakened in its ordinary rhythm, but inside the home Lexi and Haley deliberately refused to let anxiety dictate the first hours of their marriage. Instead of reviewing legal documents over breakfast, Haley prepared pancakes using Emma's favorite recipe while Lexi attempted coffee strong enough to wake the entire neighborhood. The attempt failed spectacularly. After one sip, Haley grimaced so dramatically that Lexi burst into laughter.
"That's not coffee," Haley declared. "That's industrial solvent." Lexi took another careful sip before quietly pouring the entire pot into the sink. Fair criticism.
The brief moment of humor reminded both of them that normal life still existed beyond corporate crises.
A little later, Emma arrived carrying an overnight bag and immediately noticed unopened wedding presents stacked neatly against one wall. "You two haven't opened any of them?" she asked in disbelief. Haley pointed toward the mountain of boxes. "Yesterday became complicated."
Emma looked at the stack, then at the serious expressions on their faces. Without another word, she picked up the largest package, tore away the wrapping paper, and revealed an elaborate stand mixer from the scholarship.
"Students. There," she announced. One present opened.
"Your marriage has officially begun." By the time she left an hour later, the atmosphere inside the apartment felt noticeably lighter. Even Lexi admitted that Emma possessed an unusual ability to interrupt worry before it became overwhelming. Shortly before 6 in the evening, Arthur arrived accompanied by the company's head of security, Sofia Mendoza, a former intelligence officer whose calm professionalism immediately inspired confidence. Sofia unfolded architectural drawings of the private library where the meeting would take place. The building has 3 public entrances, one underground archive level, and a rooftop greenhouse that was added during renovations 15 years ago. She pointed towards several marked locations.
"My team will remain outside. No visible intervention unless either of you requests assistance or an immediate threat emerges." Lexi nodded. "No concealed recording devices?" Sofia shook her head.
The invitation specifically requested a private conversation.
Bringing hidden equipment could create unnecessary complications if discovered. Arthur handed Lexi a thin folder.
"Everything we uncovered about Victor Hale's failed takeover." Lexi flipped through handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and board minutes dating back more than 2 decades.
One document immediately caught her attention.
During the original negotiations, Victor Hale had insisted on relocating production overseas to reduce labor costs by nearly 60%.
Lexi's parents had rejected the proposal unanimously despite pressure from several shareholders.
Another page contained an internal memo describing anonymous threats sent to senior executives during that conflict. The final page listed everyone present during the decisive board vote.
Lexi frowned.
There were 12 directors.
Arthur nodded. Only 8 remained with the company afterward. What happened to the others? Arthur hesitated. 2 retired. He tapped another pair of names. 2 resigned unexpectedly within weeks. Haley studied the document. Did anyone ever investigate why? Arthur answered quietly.
At the time, everyone assumed they simply accepted better opportunities elsewhere.
He closed the folder. Now I'm no longer certain.
At precisely 7 o'clock, their car stopped outside the old library. Built from pale stone more than a century earlier, the building possessed an almost cathedral-like quiet. Tall windows reflected the fading colors of sunset while ivy climbed weathered walls untouched by modern architecture surrounding it. Sofia's security team remained discreetly across the street. Lexi and Haley entered together. The library appeared almost empty. Endless shelves stretched beneath vaulted ceilings while antique lamps cast warm circles of light across polished wooden floors.
Somewhere deeper inside, an old clock ticked steadily. A librarian approached. "Mrs. Ashcroft?" Lexi nodded.
"She's waiting in the reading gallery."
The librarian offered no further explanation.
They followed a winding corridor until the shelves opened into a magnificent circular room lined with rare books and enormous stained glass windows. At its center stood a single round table. A woman rose slowly from one of the chairs as they entered. Clara Hale looked younger than either of them had expected, perhaps in her early 50s, with silver beginning to appear at her temples.
She wore a charcoal gray suit without jewelry or unnecessary decoration.
Her posture conveyed discipline rather than arrogance, and her expression remained unreadable.
"Thank you for coming," she said.
Her voice carried neither hostility nor warmth.
"Congratulations on your wedding." Lexi remained standing. "You interrupted it." Clara inclined her head slightly. "Yes." "Why?" "Because timing matters." Haley noticed that Clara's gaze lingered briefly on their wedding rings before returning to Lexi's face. "You could have contacted us any other day." Clara pulled out 2 empty chairs. "Please sit. I imagine you have many questions." "Neither." Woman moved immediately. Finally Haley sat first. Lexi joined her. Clara remained standing for another moment before opening a worn leather portfolio. Instead of contracts or financial statements, she removed a faded photograph. 3 young people stood together outside a design school, laughing at something beyond the camera. Lexi immediately recognized her mother. Beside her stood a younger Arthur Winslow. On the opposite side smiled a man who strongly resembled the photographs of Victor Hale, though his expression carried youthful optimism rather than bitterness. Clara gently placed the photograph on the table. "Before they became enemies," she said, "they were friends." Lexi stared at the image. "My mother never mentioned this. She rarely spoke about that period." Clara unfolded another photograph. This one showed all 3 working inside a modest workshop filled with sewing machines. They dreamed of building a company together. Silence settled heavily over the room. Clara continued. "My father was brilliant with finance. Your mother possessed extraordinary creative vision. Arthur understood law better than anyone else in their class. They planned everything." Haley looked toward Lexi, whose expression revealed genuine surprise. "What happened?" Clara answered without hesitation. "Success." She slowly sat down. As investors became involved, priorities changed. My father believed rapid expansion required difficult compromises. Your mother refused to sacrifice craftsmanship or employee welfare. Arthur tried to mediate. Clara folded her hands. Eventually friendship collapsed beneath ambition. Lexi shook her head. "That still doesn't explain what you're doing now." Clara looked directly into her eyes. "Because the story you've inherited is incomplete." She reached into the portfolio once more and withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age. Across the front appeared handwriting almost identical to the letter Lexi had received from her mother after the wedding. Addressed simply to Victor. Clara carefully slid the envelope across the table. "My father never opened it." Lexi frowned. "Why not?" Clara's answer came quietly. "Because by the time it arrived, he had already decided he knew what it said." Haley watched Lexi carefully break the brittle seal. Inside rested several handwritten pages. As Lexi began reading, her expression shifted from suspicion to confusion, then to unmistakable sadness. Her mother had written not to condemn Victor Hale, but to apologize. She acknowledged mistakes made during their final negotiations, admitted that pride had prevented honest conversation, and expressed hope that one day they might rebuild the friendship they had lost. The final paragraph stopped Lexi completely. "No company is worth becoming strangers. If you ever wish to talk instead of fight, my door will always remain open." Clara quietly spoke while Lexi finished reading. The letter arrived 2 days after my father suffered a stroke. She looked toward the stained glass windows. He never regained the ability to read. Lexi lowered the pages slowly. He never knew. Clara nodded. No. Another long silence followed. Finally Haley asked the question neither of them had expected. Then why begin another conflict now? Clara closed her eyes briefly before answering. Because I spent years believing your family destroyed mine. Her voice remained controlled, yet beneath the discipline lay unmistakable exhaustion. After my father's death I inherited his records, his bitterness, and his unfinished plans. I told myself I was correcting history. She looked toward the unopened letter still resting between them. Then, 6 months ago, I discovered this hidden inside one of his personal safes. Lexi understood immediately. You realized the truth. Clara gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. I realized the truth was more complicated than revenge allows. Haley leaned forward. If that's true, why purchase nearly a third of the company? Clara met her gaze directly. Because someone else was already doing it. Neither Lexi nor Haley spoke. Clara reached into the portfolio one final time and placed a thick dossier onto the table. I didn't build those shell companies. She opened the file to reveal dozens of financial records marked with handwritten notes. I bought shares to stop another investor from obtaining them first. Lexi's heartbeat quickened. Who? Clara slowly turned the final page. A single name appeared at the top, accompanied by recent corporate registrations, acquisition strategies, and photographs taken only weeks earlier. Lexi stared at the page in disbelief. The name belonged to someone she trusted completely, someone who had stood beside her during countless victories, celebrated her wedding only yesterday, and never once given the slightest reason to invite suspicion. The realization struck with such force that for several seconds she could not even speak, while Clara quietly said, "The takeover everyone fears is real. The mistake is believing I am the person leading it." Lexi read the name again, convinced her eyes had betrayed her. The letters remained exactly the same. She slowly closed the dossier before opening it once more, as though repetition might somehow transform the impossible into a misunderstanding. It did not. Across from her, Clara waited without pressing for a reaction. Haley leaned closer until she could read the page herself. Her breath caught. No, she whispered. The name belonged to Adrian Mercer, the company's chief financial officer. Adrian had worked beside Lexi for more than 11 years. He had helped negotiate international partnerships, personally overseen scholarship funding during its first year, attended countless strategy meetings, and only yesterday had stood near the front row during the wedding ceremony, applauding with what appeared to be genuine happiness. He had even embraced Lexi afterward, wishing both newlyweds a lifetime of joy. This can't be right, Haley said quietly. Clara slid another folder across the table. I hoped it wasn't. Inside were copies of banking records, property purchases, encrypted communications that had been legally obtained during a separate financial investigation, and photographs showing Adrian meeting representatives from several shell corporations over the previous 18 months. Every image had a date, a location, and supporting documentation. Nothing appeared sensationalized. Everything looked meticulously verified. Lexi examined each page with growing disbelief. Why bring this to me instead of the authorities? Clara answered immediately. Because none of it is illegal by itself. Buying shares isn't a crime, Haley realized. Correct, Clara said. Neither is meeting investors. Neither is forming holding companies. The problem is understanding why. Lexi looked up. Then tell me. Clara folded her hands. Adrian isn't trying to destroy the company. She paused. He's trying to rebuild it in his own image. Lexi frowned. Meaning? He believes the future belongs to automation, licensing, and global manufacturing partnerships. He intends to reduce design departments, outsource production, and transform your company into a luxury brand managed primarily through financial efficiency rather than craftsmanship. Haley's expression hardened. Everything this company stands for disappears. Clara nodded once. Precisely.
Lexi remembered conversations she had dismissed over the past year.
Adrian had repeatedly encouraged expanding automated production. He had recommended closing several small artisan workshops because their operating costs exceeded industry averages. He had argued that customers cared more about branding than the people making the garments. At the time, their disagreements had seemed purely strategic. Now every discussion appeared in an entirely different light. Why attend the wedding? Haley asked. Clara gave a sad smile. Because people planning major corporate moves rarely stop behaving normally. Suspicion grows where behavior changes. Lexi slowly closed the dossier. Does he know you've uncovered this? No. Does he know you've contacted us? Also no. Haley studied Clara carefully. Throughout the conversation she had searched for signs of manipulation, exaggerated emotion, or concealed satisfaction. Instead she found only fatigue. Clara looked less like someone celebrating an elaborate victory and more like a woman trying to prevent history from repeating itself. You said you inherited your father's bitterness, Haley said gently. When did you let it go? Clara looked toward the old stained glass windows. Evening light scattered colors across the wooden floor. The day I opened that letter. Her voice remained steady. I realized my father and Lexi's mother had spent years trapped inside assumptions neither ever corrected. They stopped speaking directly. Everyone else began speaking for them. By the time either wanted reconciliation, life had moved too far. She looked back at Lexi. I decided I would not make the same mistake. Silence lingered around the table. Finally Lexi asked, will you help us stop Adrian? Clara considered the question for several moments. Only if we agree on one condition. Which is? No revenge. Haley exchanged a glance with Lexi. Clara continued. If Adrian has broken the law, let the law judge him. If he has violated corporate ethics, let the board remove him. But don't become what my father became after losing. Win without hatred. Lexi extended her hand across the table. Agreed. Clara accepted the handshake. Then we begin tonight. Over the next 3 hours the library transformed into an unofficial strategy room. Arthur joined them after receiving an encrypted message from Lexi, arriving visibly surprised to find Clara waiting calmly beside stacks of historical documents. The initial tension between the old lawyer and Victor Hale's daughter could almost be felt in the air. Arthur spoke first. I never expected to see you again. Clara answered honestly. Neither did I. Instead of dwelling on the past, they spread financial records across a long oak table and began tracing ownership structures together. Arthur's encyclopedic knowledge of corporate law